June 28, 1919. Inside one of the most beautiful rooms ever built, a hall of gold and mirrors that once echoed with royal laughter, a group of exhausted men bent over a table. They picked up their pens. They signed their names. And with those signatures, they believed they had ended the deadliest war the world had ever seen. They were wrong. What they actually did, in that gilded palace outside Paris, was plant the seeds for something far worse. A second war. A war that would kill 3 times as many people. A war that would introduce the world to concentration camps, atomic bombs, and industrial-scale genocide. This is the story of the Treaty of Versailles. The peace agreement that wasn't peaceful. The end of one catastrophe and the beginning of another. To understand what happened in that palace in 1919, you first need to understand what the world looked like in 1914. It was supposed to be the age of progress. Europe was rich, industrialized, connected by railways and telegraph lines. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, had built empires that spanned the globe. Many people believed the world had become too civilized, too economically intertwined, to ever go to war again. They were spectacularly wrong. On June 28, 1914, a date that will matter deeply before this video ends, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip pulled a trigger in a Sarajevo street. The man he shot was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What followed was like watching a row of dominoes fall in slow motion. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, was drawn in. Germany invaded France through Belgium. Britain, bound by treaty to protect Belgium, entered the war. Within 6 weeks, half of Europe was at war. What began as a regional crisis became something no one had ever seen before. A modern industrial war. The machine gun, poison gas, tanks, submarines, aerial bombing. These were not the weapons of the Napoleonic era. They were the weapons of mass production, and they killed on a scale that defied imagination. Soldiers on both sides dug themselves into the ground and fought over the same few miles of mud for 4 years. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British and Commonwealth forces suffered over 57,000 casualties in a single day. 57,000. In one day? By the time the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, as if the war even wanted to be theatrical about it, the numbers were almost too large to comprehend. Somewhere between 17 and 20 million people were dead. Another 20 million had been wounded. Entire generations of young men had been swallowed whole by the trenches of France and Belgium, the battlefields of Eastern Europe, the deserts of the Middle East. France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers. Britain over 900,000. Germany close to 2 million. Russia, which had already collapsed into revolution, may have lost over 1.7 million military dead alone. And then came the Spanish flu, a pandemic riding on the weakened, starving, exhausted bodies of a continent at war, killing another 50 million people worldwide. The cities of northern France and Belgium looked like the surface of the moon. Entire villages had simply ceased to exist. Forests had been reduced to stumps and splinters. Europe had not just lost a war. It had lost its confidence in civilization itself. And into that wreckage, physical, emotional, spiritual, walked the men who were supposed to build a new world. January 1919. Paris. Representatives from 32 nations descended on the French capital to decide what the world would look like after the catastrophe. But everyone knew who would really be making the decisions. 3 men, 3 visions, 3 sets of irreconcilable demands. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe to a reception no American president had ever received. Crowds lined the streets of Paris in their thousands, throwing flowers, weeping with relief. To exhausted Europeans, this tall, professorial man from New Jersey represented something extraordinary: hope. Wilson had spent the war crafting his vision for the post-war world. He called it the 14 Points, a blueprint for a new international order built on reason, fairness, and something he believed could prevent all future wars. National self-determination, the right of peoples to govern themselves. Open diplomacy instead of secret treaties. Freedom of the seas. And above all, a League of Nations. An international organization where countries could resolve disputes through dialogue rather than bullets. Wilson was not naive. He was a former university president, a serious intellectual, a man who had thought deeply about what had gone wrong in 1914. He genuinely believed that this conference could be different, that great powers could choose justice over revenge. He would be disappointed. Georges Clemenceau was 77 years old, and he had spent a lifetime watching Germany destroy France. He remembered 1870, when Prussian forces had humiliated France, seized the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, and crowned their Kaiser in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the very same room where the treaty would now be signed. He had been a mayor of Paris during the 1870 siege. He had watched his city starve. And now, 50 years later, he had watched the northern third of his country turned into a wasteland. Clemenceau had one goal at the Paris Peace Conference. One goal only: make sure Germany could never do this again. The French press called him the Tiger. His cabinet ministers called him impossible. His enemies called him ruthless. All of them were right. Clemenceau wanted Germany crushed. Financially, militarily, territorially. He wanted reparations so enormous that Germany would be paying for a generation. He wanted borders so stripped that Germany could never again threaten France. Back in Paris, there were riots in the streets if he appeared to go soft. The French public had lost 1.4 million sons. They wanted justice, and they wanted it to look like punishment. And then there was David Lloyd George. The British Prime Minister was, in many ways, the most interesting man in the room. Charming, shrewd, politically brilliant, and deeply conflicted. Lloyd George had just won a British election on the slogan, "Make Germany Pay." His voters wanted revenge. His newspapers screamed for it. His coalition partners demanded it. But privately, Lloyd George was worried. He understood economics in a way that Clemenceau did not. He knew that a Germany destroyed beyond recovery would become a Germany radicalized beyond control. He had read the intelligence reports about communist uprisings spreading from Russia. A bankrupt, humiliated Germany could go the same way. He also knew that Britain needed German trade to survive, that a prostrate Germany was bad for everyone. Lloyd George tried to steer between Wilson's idealism and Clemenceau's fury. He often failed. The political pressure from London was simply too intense. For 6 months, these three men and their enormous teams of advisors, diplomats, economists, and generals argued, bargained, threatened, and compromised their way through one of the most consequential negotiations in human history. Germany was not invited. Let that sink in for a moment. The country most affected by the treaty, the country that would be asked to accept its terms, was given no seat at the table. The German delegation waited in a separate hotel outside Paris, receiving draft terms, sending back written objections that were largely ignored. They called it a diktat, a dictated peace. They weren't wrong. When the final terms were delivered to the German delegation in May 1919, the reaction was shock. Not because they expected to walk away unpunished. They knew they had lost the war. The shock was the sheer totality of what was being demanded. Germany lost approximately 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine, seized by Germany in 1871, was returned to France. That was perhaps the least controversial provision. Even many Germans accepted it. But the rest cut far deeper. The Rhineland, the industrial heartland of Western Germany, would be occupied by Allied forces and permanently demilitarized. No German soldier could set foot there. The Saar region, rich in coal mines, was placed under League of Nations administration and its coal production handed to France for 15 years. In the east, a new country was born, Poland. And to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea, the treaty carved a corridor of territory right through the middle of Germany. This Polish corridor separated East Prussia, a historically German region, from the rest of Germany. Millions of ethnic Germans now lived outside German borders. The port city of Danzig, overwhelmingly German in population, was declared a free city under League of Nations supervision. Germany also lost all of its overseas colonies. German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, German possessions in the Pacific and China. All of it distributed among Britain, France, Japan, and others under League of Nations mandates, which, in practice, meant new colonial masters. The German military was effectively destroyed as a major force. The army was capped at 100,000 men. No tanks, no heavy artillery, no air force. The German Navy was reduced to a skeleton, with all major warships surrendered, many of which were later deliberately sunk by their own crews at Scapa Flow in Scotland rather than handed over. The General Staff, the brilliant, professional military organization that had made Germany such a formidable opponent, was dissolved. Germany was forbidden from forming alliances with Austria. The logic was sound. Together, a united German-Austrian state would be enormous. Apart, they would be weaker. And then came the money. The treaty required Germany to pay reparations for all damage caused to civilians and their property during the war. The precise figure wasn't decided immediately. That would come later in 1921, but when it arrived, it was staggering. 132 billion gold marks. In modern terms, somewhere between 400 billion and 500 billion US dollars. Germany was also required to deliver coal, timber, livestock, and industrial equipment to the Allies immediately. French and Belgian factories destroyed by the war needed to be rebuilt at German expense. The economic consequences would take years to fully materialize. But when they did, they would be catastrophic. But there was one provision that cut deeper than all the others. One sentence that would haunt Europe for the next 20 years. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles stated, in plain language, that Germany, and Germany alone, accepted responsibility for causing the war. The War Guilt Clause. This was not just a legal provision. It was a moral verdict. It told the German people that their sons had died in a war their country had started. That every widow, every amputee, every orphan on the Allied side was Germany's fault. The reparations flowed from this clause. The legal logic was simple. If you cause the war, you pay for the damage. The political logic was toxic, because here is what almost every German believed, including many German politicians who had actually opposed the war in 1914. The war was not their fault alone. Austria-Hungary had made the ultimatum that started the chain reaction. Russia had mobilized first. France had its own imperial ambitions. Britain had its own interests in continental balance. The causes of the First World War are genuinely complex. Historians have argued about them for over a century. Forcing Germany to accept sole guilt for a conflict that had many authors was not justice. It was politics. June 28, 1919. The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The irony was deliberate, crushing, even. 48 years earlier, in this exact room, after defeating France in the Franco-Prussian War, the German Kaiser had been proclaimed in a ceremony designed to humiliate the French. Bismarck and his generals had stood in this golden hall and declared the birth of the German Empire. Now, the Germans were back, but not as victors. The two German delegates, Foreign Minister Hermann Müller and Transport Minister Johannes Bell, walked into the hall to a room full of people who despised them. They were not generals, not the men who had made the decisions. Germany's wartime leadership had been swept aside in the revolution that followed defeat. These were civilian politicians, members of the new democratic Weimar Republic. They were being asked to sign a treaty for a war they had not started. The silence as they walked to the table was suffocating. Clemenceau spoke briefly, coldly. The Germans signed. Wilson signed. Lloyd George signed. Clemenceau signed. 32 nations added their names to what would become one of the most consequential documents in human history. Outside, church bells rang. Crowds cheered. In the palace gardens, fountains were turned on for the first time since the war began. The world celebrated. Germany went silent. German newspapers would call the treaty a stab in the back, a betrayal, a humiliation that no self-respecting nation could accept. One German veteran, a 29-year-old corporal who had been temporarily blinded by a British gas attack, was recovering in a military hospital in Bavaria when he heard the news of Germany's defeat. He wept. Then he vowed revenge. His name was Adolf Hitler. The Treaty of Versailles was just one piece of a much larger reconstruction. The Paris Peace Conference didn't just settle the war with Germany. It redesigned the entire world. For great empires had collapsed during or immediately after the First World War. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. In their place, a patchwork of new nations had to be created from scratch. Czechoslovakia was born, a nation combining Czech and Slovak peoples who had never before shared a single state. Yugoslavia united several southern Slavic groups under one flag: Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, who had very different histories and, it would turn out, very different ideas about who should be in charge. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. Millions of Hungarians suddenly found themselves living as minorities in Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories were carved up between Britain and France under League of Nations mandates. Britain took Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. The borders were drawn with rulers on maps by men in Paris who had often never visited these places. They ignored tribal boundaries, religious communities, ancient rivalries. Many of the conflicts burning in the Middle East today trace their origins to those lines drawn in Paris in 1919. Wilson had sacrificed much of his 14 points to get one thing: the League of Nations. The League was an extraordinary idea, genuinely revolutionary. An assembly of nations that would meet regularly, resolve disputes through arbitration, impose economic sanctions on aggressors, and, if necessary, coordinate military action to stop wars. For the first time in human history, there would be an international institution designed to prevent conflict rather than just respond to it. Wilson was so proud of the League that he personally wrote its founding charter, the Covenant, into the treaty itself. 44 nations joined. And then Wilson went home to face his own Senate. America never joined the League of Nations. The Senate, led by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, refused to ratify the treaty. They feared the League would drag America into foreign wars, surrender American sovereignty to an international body, and undermine the Monroe Doctrine. Wilson suffered a massive stroke while campaigning across America to win public support for the League. He never fully recovered. Without America, the world's largest economy, the power that had tipped the military balance in Europe, the League was crippled from the start. It had no army, no real enforcement mechanism, and without Washington, no credibility. The institution designed to guarantee the peace had been abandoned by the man who designed it. Even before the ink was dry, serious people were sounding the alarm. John Maynard Keynes, a young British economist who had been part of the British delegation at Paris, resigned in disgust and went home to write a book. He called it The Economic Consequences of the Peace. It became a sensation. Keynes argued with devastating clarity that the reparations demanded from Germany were economically impossible to pay, that the territorial losses would destroy the German industrial base, that the Allies had not built peace, they had built a slow-burning catastrophe. He was largely right. In the early 1920s, Germany's economy imploded under the weight of reparations and the terms of the treaty. Inflation became hyperinflation. The German mark became worthless, literally. People burned currency for warmth. Factory workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before the money lost its value by the afternoon. Middle-class families who had saved their entire lives found their savings wiped out overnight. The psychological wound was as deep as the financial one. German politicians, including those who had opposed the war, including socialists and Democrats who had genuinely wanted peace, were forced to defend a treaty they hadn't signed and couldn't repudiate. Every economic crisis could be blamed on Versailles. Every unemployment figure, every closed factory, every hungry child. Extremists on both the left and right offered simple answers to complex problems. And Germany, stripped of its pride and its savings simultaneously, was in a mood to listen. Adolf Hitler didn't invent the resentment that fueled his rise. The Treaty of Versailles had manufactured it, bottled it, and distributed it across an entire nation. Hitler's political career was built almost entirely on a single argument. The war guilt clause was a lie. Germany had been betrayed. The November criminals, the politicians who signed the armistice and then the treaty, had stabbed Germany in the back. The German army had not been defeated on the field. It had been undermined at home. Every speech, every rally, every chapter of Mein Kampf circled back to Versailles. It was not just propaganda. It resonated because, for millions of Germans, it felt true. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, wiping out the brief economic recovery Germany had achieved in the mid-1920s, the old wounds tore open again. By 1933, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. Within 6 years, he would tear up the Treaty of Versailles entirely. Remilitarizing the Rhineland, annexing Austria, swallowing Czechoslovakia, and finally invading Poland. The Allied powers, exhausted and traumatized by the First World War, tried to appease him. They failed. On September 1, 1939, 20 years and 2 months after the Treaty of Versailles had officially ended the First World War, the Second World War began. Some historians call them the same war with a 20-year ceasefire in the middle. Others argue that's too simple. But almost none would deny that the seeds of 1939 were planted in Paris in 1919. Historians have argued about Versailles for over a century, and the debate is more nuanced than the simple verdict that it was too harsh that you often hear. Some historians push back on the Versailles caused Hitler narrative. They point out that Weimar Germany had a functioning democracy for over a decade, that Germany's economy had largely recovered by the mid-1920s, that the Great Depression, a global economic crisis that devastated every industrial nation, was the real trigger for Hitler's rise, not the treaty itself. They note that Germany's humiliation was, in some ways, less severe than what Germany itself had imposed on Russia in the 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a treaty that stripped Russia of nearly a third of its European territory. They argue that the problem with Versailles wasn't that it was too harsh. It was that it was harsh enough to humiliate Germany, but not harsh enough to permanently weaken it. The worst of both worlds. Others argue the opposite, that the architects of Versailles were operating under impossible constraints. Clemenceau had an electorate demanding blood. Lloyd George had a parliament demanding payment. Wilson was fighting his own Senate. They were not philosophers crafting an ideal peace. They were politicians trying to survive. And there is a third argument, rarely heard but worth considering. What if the mistake wasn't the harshness of the peace, but the failure to enforce it? When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, violating the treaty openly and brazenly, France had the legal right and the military strength to stop him. French generals advised intervention. The politicians hesitated, and Hitler walked away emboldened, certain that the Western democracies would not fight. Perhaps Versailles was not the problem. Perhaps the problem was the combination of a punishing peace with a failure of nerve to defend it. The truth, as always in history, is complicated. Versailles was shaped by exhausted, frightened men trying to prevent the last war from happening again. They couldn't see the next one coming. On a summer day in 1919, in a golden room built to celebrate the glory of French kings, men with pens drew a line under the worst catastrophe in human history. They wanted to prevent another war. They created the conditions for a worse one. And yet, here is the part that gets lost in the tragedy. They were not villains. Clemenceau had watched his country bleed twice in 50 years. His fury was not irrational. It was the fury of a father who has lost his children and wants someone to answer for it. Wilson had looked at 4 years of industrial slaughter and dreamed of something better. The League of Nations was flawed, but the idea behind it, that nations should talk before they fight, was not wrong. It just needed another war and 50 million more deaths before the world was finally ready to build it properly. The United Nations, created in 1945, was Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, built on the foundation of everything the world had learned from getting it wrong the first time. Lloyd George, reflecting on what they had built, reportedly said, "We shall have to do the whole thing over again in 25 years at 3 times the cost." He was almost exactly right. The Treaty of Versailles is not simply a cautionary tale about punishment and revenge. It is a lesson about the gap between what we intend and what we create, about how the decisions made in conference rooms by tired, fallible, politically pressured human beings can echo through generations, about how a single document, signed in a palace in France on a warm June afternoon, can set in motion a chain of events that leads to Auschwitz, Hiroshima, the ruins of Berlin. 106 years later, the Hall of Mirrors still stands. The tourists still come. They photograph their reflections in the golden glass. They admire the beauty. Most of them don't know what happened here. Most of them don't know that the peace signed in this room helped end the world as it was and begin the world as we know it. Now you do.